Okay, thank you very much. We've been told we're ready to start. And welcome to all in the room. I would like to start off by recognizing our co-hosts here with us. SNV, Alive for Climate, the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, the CGIAR Impact Platform for Food Security, Nutrition and Health, the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and the World Wildlife Fund. Diverse stakeholders, because what we are looking to do today is have a nuanced discussion about the role of animal source foods in our food systems in the context of all the climate challenges that we face there and the dietary patterns that we actually see. So we're going to have a wonderful discussion. And given the diverse perspectives of our speakers, as well as those of you that are in the room, we can learn from each other's perspectives. That's the whole point of a nuanced discussion. So to start us off, I'm going to first introduce the four people you see up front here. There are others that are hiding there that I will introduce later on. So we're going to have, in total, actually, 6 speakers. First, we'll start with Shakuntala Tilstead, who is CGIAR Director for Nutrition, Health and Food Security Impact Platform. She was awarded the 2021 World Food Prize for her groundbreaking research on critical insights and landmark innovations in developing holistic, nutrition-sensitive approaches to aquatic food systems. So we've got a World Prize winner among us. Then to her left, we have Jess Colston, who is Environment Technical Lead at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. You see, I'm trying really hard not to use acronyms. She leads programs, partnerships, and advocacy work to help realize the Global Alliance's ambition to become a green nutrition NGO. Then we have Rory. I have to remember how to pronounce the name. Rory Petre, who has been the Executive Director of Global Roundtable on Sustainable Beef since 2012. He has worked on farming systems and veterinary development in many projects in Africa and Asia. So we can get from him a combination of global North and global South. And then we have 2 colleagues there that will reflect after they have listened carefully to everything we will be talking about. And that's Pumulo Maposa, Country Director for SNV in Rwanda. Put up your hand so they can see you. And then Vivian Madweke, Climate, Health, Food Justice at Global Alliance for the Future of Food. Welcome. So, like I said, it's nuance we are looking for. So, Shakuntala, if you can start us off with a keynote, please. I give you my microphone.
Thank you so much, Namukudo. And you say a keynote, I'll keep it short. But this is an extremely important topic. And I can go on from a long, long time about the importance of this topic and where we are today and where we want to go. As you know, as I said, it's important, but it's currently a much debated topic. Our nutrition goals continue to evolve. And if we take the last 60 years where we started off with a concentration on few staple foods, on the quantity of the foods we eat, and the energy contents of the food, we've we've moved much further from there, from where we are. At that time, we talked about and focused on supplying quantity, as I said, and only focused on the energy content of food. And that was great because we abated hunger and malnutrition in millions of people around the world, especially in Asia and in Africa. But our goals have shifted with time, and we are now interested in looking at other values of food, diverse foods, the increased nutritional quality of the foods with greater intakes of vitamins, minerals, protein, and essential fatty acids. And for all these nutrients that I name, animal source foods are extremely important. In moving further with our nutrition goals, we now have included aspects of diversity, culturally acceptability, which is extremely important. Diversity is fundamental for the nutritional value of our food. And when we talk about quality of food, it's just not the nutritional value of the food, but also the safety of our foods. And that's extremely important also when we talk about animal source foods, because they are highly perishable. As we keep evolving with our nutritional goals, we now include sustainability, and sustainability across the food systems. Sustainability in consumption, for example, reducing waste from as part of the consumption, but also back to the supply chains and in production, and ensuring that the inputs we have for production are more sustainable. Fundamental to achieving nutritional goals is equity and justice, the rights of all, leaving no one behind. And for this, it is extremely important we focus on a people-centered approach. And it is imperative that we take into consideration culture and geography, where people live, and firstly, their culture. In doing so, we do know that animal source foods, for example, milk, eggs, and meat, and also diverse animal source foods from waters, are extremely important for meeting our nutritional goals. And this is not only are they culturally acceptable and placed highly in diets of different population groups, but they are of extremely high nutritional value. I've named some of the micronutrients that they supply, also essential fatty acids and protein. So these animal source foods and their benefits cannot be ignored when we talk about how do we meet the nutritional goals of different population groups, making sure that we take into consideration diversity and, most importantly, culturally acceptability. We must do more to better understand the benefits of animal source foods. For example, for women and children in the first 1,000 days of life. It's extremely important for growth, for development and cognition that we meet the nutrient needs of micronutrients, essential fatty acids, and protein, which are extremely important. Just take cognition. Globally, we have reached some way with animal source foods. If we look at the UN Nutrition, the first two papers that the UN Nutrition do, global position papers that they produce, the first one in 2021 was on diverse aquatic foods, and the second one was on livestock. And these two papers framed a bit of the agenda for the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021. I said a bit, we could have gone further, but on the other hand, if we did not have these papers which were giving the science and the evidence on the importance of aquatic foods for healthy, sustainable diets, perhaps these foods would have been ignored in the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021 and also in the follow-up that we are having now. So these, I do implore you to look at these papers on the internet and read them because they really are important in giving the benefits of animal source foods. Let me conclude with a call for action, and I have two. One is creating more space and better understanding for the diverse roles and value of animal source foods for diverse population groups. And when I talk about that, it's also because if you look at diverse population groups, you must take into consideration culture, you must take into consideration geography, seasonality. There are many aspects to take into consideration when looking at diverse population groups. Secondly, I'd like to see more investments in the area of animal source foods for reaching nutritional goals. For example, investments in the science of what animal source foods in diets mean for improving, not improving, but increasing the bioavailability of micronutrients that are found in plant source foods. We do know that from scientific research that adding small amounts of animal source foods to diets can give you a 10 to 15% increase in bioavailability in humans. I'd also like a call for looking at more sustainable feeding practices and production systems of animal source foods. In doing so, I'd also want to see a priority in the inclusion of traditional knowledge and practices that we can use in order that we can ensure and in order that we can see that animal source foods have a greater impact than they have today on reaching the nutritional needs of different population groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shakuntala. You've really set a foundation for us, and that really makes me want to go to Jess first. She's indicated to us about the value and what have you, but let's go to low, middle, and income countries. Why do you think animal source foods are important, specifically for low, middle income countries? And from the work that you have done at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, can you indicate what are the challenging trade-offs that we have to contend with? And perhaps there are some synergies. What are those? Over to you.
Thanks, Namakolo. And I'm delighted to be here because I think this conversation really gets to the heart of these tricky issues between climate and environment and nutrition. And I think Shakuntala has set the scene well in terms of the nutritional value of animal source foods. In many of the countries where GAIN works, in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, there are populations who are eating diets that are incredibly undiverse. They're really based on starchy staple foods. And if you're able to eat a diverse plant-based diet, you might get many of the micronutrients, the protein that you need. But if your diet is dependent on those starchy staples, eating even a small amount of animal source foods makes a massive difference to your nutrition, particularly, as you say, for vulnerable population groups. I think it creates a very interesting area for GAIN's work. As you introduced me, I'm the environment lead at GAIN. It's my role to make sure everything we do is in support of a sustainable food systems transformation as well as one that supports nutrition. And animal source foods is that really tricky issue to get right. And what we try to do is really understand where is that need for people to consume more animal source foods, and that looks different everywhere GAIN works, even within the countries we work in. There are huge differences in what's consumed, where, and by whom. And really thinking carefully about which animal source foods we're promoting. So we think a lot about the different footprints of, say, dairy versus beef and red meat versus chicken versus small fish, which I know Shakuntal has worked on an awful lot. And we seek really to look at what maximizes that nutritional benefit, what helps people achieve those nutritional needs they have within the smallest possible environmental footprint. And one idea I'd like to bring into the discussion, and I hope we can discuss it more and come back to it, is the idea of what the pathway is, because it's not a static situation either. In every country we work, there are groups who are under-consuming animal source foods today, but there are groups who are over-consuming, even in places like Nigeria or Pakistan, in Indonesia where we work as well, where people have moved to cities, their diets have shifted to more westernized patterns of eating, and they're now consuming amounts of meat or animal source foods which might be detrimental to their health in terms of NCDs. And then there's a large group of people for whom that might be the case in the future. They're current under-consumers, but in the future they could move and start consuming at a much higher rate. So we try and be very thoughtful, not just about what we're doing today, but really what that might look like in the future and the type of pathway that the countries we work in might be on in terms of animal source foods. I hope we can come back and discuss more. Namakuli.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have the tricky thing of I can grab the microphones from people since there's only one to go around. The next person I want to go to is actually Rory. Because you can bring in this broader perspective of production, especially under intensive perspectives of production practices. So what I want to ask you is it possible to balance improving sustainability of beef production and the growing need for animal source foods? Can we really balance that and actually get to sustainable levels of production?
Well, yeah, clearly I think that we can, because that's been my job for the last 10 or 12 years. I think it's important to consider two things when we talk about sustainable feed. One is the fact that, certainly in terms of the ruminant herd, the vast majority of the feed is not something that humans can consume directly. In other words, we're talking about fodder from grasslands, from rangelands, and from crop byproducts, and that makes up around about 85% of the diet of animals. A lot of the rest of the diet is also derived from byproducts from human food systems and fuel systems. So if you think about, the much talked about North American system, where they have very intensive feedlots, a lot of the feed that is consumed in those feedlots comes from the ethanol industry, so the byproducts in terms of distillers' grains, etc. So overall, we're talking around about 90% of the feed that is going into ruminant productions as being something that is not human edible or certainly not human desirable. We're also talking about 3/4 of the land that we use for food production that is not capable of producing human edible crops. So think about, in my case, I've worked in Southern Africa for 5 years. I've worked in Central Asia, in Afghanistan. I've worked in Pakistan and India. And there are large areas in all of those continents which cannot reliably produce human edible crops on a year-to-year basis. So, for example, Botswana, we could produce corn, sorghum, and millet, but in at least 4 years out of 10, we would lose the crops because there wouldn't be a sufficient yield. Ruminants are capable of being a movable food source, and they can utilize feed that humans can't directly utilize. They also provide a livelihood for over 1 billion people. So let's not oversimplify this. This is what really the message I want to give is that we need to look at the role of livestock within the overall food system, the role that they can play in complementing crop production. So clearly by consuming the byproducts and upcycling those byproducts into edible food for humans and manure, they're playing a very complementary role to crops. So these are all things we need to do. And to make it more sustainable, I would say, absolutely. If we could focus just on the things we already do, but do them more widely. And there are just a couple of facts I want to give you, and then I'll hand you the microphone back voluntarily. Just a couple of facts. So if we were to increase vaccination to 60% of our livestock, we would increase the productivity by 50%. So you could argue that by doing so, we could also reduce the number of livestock and still be feeding more people. If we had a fall in disease of 10%, we would save 800 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And if we adopted the existing practices in health and husbandry that we have now, we could feed 9 billion people without any increase in the emissions from livestock. For every 1% in reduction in cattle losses to disease, we would feed an additional 317 million people. And you can slice all of those figures either way. You can say, okay, we can produce more, or you can say, okay, we can use less. But we can be better. So let's do that.
So I actually don't want to let go of you so quickly. The question that I have for you is, you've talked about feeding livestock, the grass that people can't eat, the residues that people can't eat. When we're talking about climate, there's always the issue of carbon sequestration. Are we taking everything off the land by engaging in livestock production? Have you seen any examples of grasslands where we are grazing livestock where we can actually end up with a net carbon sink? Is that possible?
It is definitely possible, but it's increasingly rare. And what we need to do is manage our grazing practices better. A lot of grazing management practices, particularly I would say in lower income countries, developing countries in Africa and Asia, that has been compromised by the spread of by opportunistic cropping and by urbanization. Allowing mobility in rangelands is essential to sustainability. As soon as you constrain the mobility of livestock, or wildlife, I have to say, you will constrain the sustainability of that grazing. So as soon as animals are not able to move freely within the former range, you'll find that you start to run into problems. It's probably fine in a year where you've got a normal or above average rainfall, but as soon as you start to get into arid years, you need those buffer zones that we previously used and which are now sometimes unavailable to us because of the spread of urbanization, the spread of cropping. But absolutely we can. We need to manage our grazing better, and if we do that, we can sequester carbon. I'm not saying that we're going to sequester carbon every year, because in a drought you will tend to lose carbon. But if you have been increasing the cover of your fodder and your forage, you will be increasing carbon, and in the years that you lose it due to drought, for example, you will still have a higher net carbon value than you would have done if you hadn't improved your carbon of your grazing practices. So we can do all of these things better, and we need to facilitate the spread of extension messages and research that enables people to do that. At the moment, you know, we can do these things in wealthy countries because people have easy access to information. They have easy access to materials and methods. That's not the case everywhere. And, you know, we need to extend it to Africa and Asia, where 60% of the large ruminants are in Africa and Asia. And those are the countries where the herds are growing. Those are the countries where the human population is growing. Those are the countries where demand for animal source foods is growing. So that is where we need to invest our money to make sure that people are being supported to do things better.
So what Rory has said, I mean, we're talking about dietary justice, right? So people need animal source foods, but then we have climate challenges, and what do we do? And so it actually makes me even more curious about your your role, coming from an institution that focuses on conservation. The curiosity that I have is, from the perspective of the World Wildlife Fund, how does livestock fit in your setting? Because it almost feels like a counterintuitive perspective. Over to you.
Thank you, and very happy to be here today. For World Wildlife Fund, sustainable livestock systems is considered a key to reducing emissions, halting land conversion, conserving biodiversity. And it's a high priority to address the challenges and also the opportunities that we have from the conservation and sustainability perspective. But I would say most importantly, we're looking at it from a perspective of a food system. So there is a systems approach here that needs to be considered when we're talking about sustainable livestock systems. So it's not just about talking about nutrition versus environmental footprint. We're talking about nutrition, food security, soil health, biodiversity, freshwater use, just so many other aspects, including socioeconomic aspects such as livelihoods, and also sociocultural aspects such as different cultural preferences in terms of what we eat, when, et cetera, and how we produce. So that, I think, is the key part that we need to have, because this is not an either-or conversation. It's a conversation that needs to permeate many other discussions that are happening. When we're talking about corn and soy production and regenerative agriculture practices, discussions that are happening in other rooms here in this pavilion and in this conference, we're also talking about livestock then. We're talking about animal source foods in many of these other conversations. And it's important that we see it from that systemic perspective. From that point of view, having said that, there are challenges to be addressed, for sure, that have been addressed here, but there's also enormous solutions that can be brought about supporting the consumption of proteins and having an improved environmental footprint. And there's two key things that I might address now while I have the microphone, which is, one, we can address the current production systems with specific measures around improved management techniques, techniques to reduce methane emissions, protecting soil, forests, savannas, grasslands, all of which are also critical as carbon sinks. And there's a second point that I think is critical, which is how do we shape the future of animal source foods? How do we support farmers, ranchers, pastoralists to be able to be the ones that are driving the future of production? And for that, it's critical that we have the right financing tools in place, that there's the policy and regulatory environment that supports that, and that we're also supporting transparent markets in which they can operate, whether it's a local market or international markets that are there. So let me stop there, and happy to talk more about other measures.
So I'm picking a number of threads. One is animal source foods for those that need it. There's some justice issues involved there. The other is less animal source foods for those that are over-consuming. There's some justice issues in there also if we need to do something to help them. Justice issues associated with how are we producing just to the environment as well, so that we can still have soil and all that for the future. And that brings me back to you before I go to the audience very briefly. How do you balance? Is there any tool you can use to balance between those that need to eat more and those that need to eat less? How do you help the two groups differently?
I think if I had that tool, I would be telling everyone about it at this COP. I think the thing for me is understanding exactly what we're talking about and where and for whom. So I think it's very important to understand the country that we're speaking about, and the differences in meat consumption are huge between countries. I mean, in the US, I think the average is 120 kilograms per person per year. And in some of the countries where we work, like Bangladesh, it's 4 kilos per person per year. But even comparing the UK to the US, the UK eats about 80 kilos per capita per year. So first of all, and then exactly within countries, that looks very different. And then I think we need to consider which animal source foods we're looking at and why, and what their respective environmental footprint is compared to the nutritional value that they're offering these different groups. And that's something that GAIN has been researching. We've been trying to take those environmental assessments you've seen that are per 100 grams or 100 calories, but instead make that comparison by nutritional value. And I think once you start to understand those things and understand the future trends, you can start to think about actually which of those foods meets those needs, which of those foods is the demand increasing for in a way which doesn't really have a cap. You know, meat is a very aspirational food in many cultures. And I think then you can start to plan and say, okay, yeah, we definitely need to increase the consumption of these foods up to a certain point for these groups, but we need to be very careful to make sure we don't create a demand and a supply where that increases and increases and increases over time beyond the capacity of us to produce that amount of animal source foods in a sustainable way. So I don't think there's a simple answer, but I think the key is that data and really, really thinking very carefully about what that means in terms of demand and trends and how we look at this going forward.
Thank you very much. I want to come in the room. The idea is to hear your perspectives as well. You can either ask a question or make a comment to contribute to the conversation. Just keep it short so that we can hear from as many people as possible.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your insights. I am Rajeshwar from Central India. And listening to you, I completely agree that we need more nutritious diets, especially in the global south. And with initiatives like the government introducing fortification for stuff like wheat, which is fortified with B12 now, so people are getting really cheap wheat with fortified B12. Salt is being fortified with iodine, and that is also available for very less. And we know through the major dietetic associations around the world that a human can be healthy on a completely plant-based diet for all stages of life, including pregnancy, childhood, adolescence, old age. And we know that we are in midst of a climate catastrophe in which we need to act very fast. And animal agriculture is one of the largest contributor to climate change and deforestation. The science is very clear on that. So I believe that we should not be using band-aids where surgeries are required. And I think we should talk more seriously about how to mitigate animal agriculture, how to reduce it, and how to shift towards more plant-based diets. What do you guys think about that?
Thank you. I think I will give it to you first because humans can survive on plant-based protein alone. So you take it, and then I'll come to you after that.
Thanks very much. I mean, I agree with you on the principle. If you have a sufficiently diverse diet, I think it can meet your nutritional needs, even if you don't consume animal source foods. I think the reality for most people in the world is that that diet is not accessible or affordable to them. And that, you know, you say we are in a climate crisis right now. Obviously, we have a crisis of malnutrition as well, where there are more than 700 million people in the world who currently are malnourished. And the challenge, I think, is balancing the easiest way we can help those people to have more nutrients in their diet, which is often through increasing animal source foods because they're so nutritionally dense, alongside trying to increase the overall diversity and affordability of diets. So I think it's very challenging. I don't think the answer is to shift everybody towards a plant-based diet long term, but I think there is an appropriate role for animal source foods from a nutritional perspective, but also that overall diversity in those plant-based foods are also incredibly important for nutrition. That's the nutrition piece. Namako, who do you want me to go to?
Yes, and then the conservation piece.
I think it's a good point. The issue is that we're in such an urgency to deliver change and to create change towards 2030 that it is not necessarily an either-or situation. I think right now we're looking at two separate tracks. One of those mean we need to address the current production system and also the projections of increased protein animal source consumption coming up in the future. So with that in mind, how do we accelerate the transformation that we have, that we need right now, while we're also working on other pieces around where and how we consume proteins and look at more of that nutrition aspect. I think there's opportunities in terms of innovations, genetics, seaweed additives that we can work on to reduce emissions. And if we really double down with the different stakeholders that are part of this and the financial institutions and across the value chain, we could create significant change if we really step it up towards 2030. So I think that's my main point. It's not an either or, but can we work on both at the same time?
Yeah, thank you so much. I would like to follow up on that because we discussed dietary justice. I understand the points that you raised, that it's very hard to make it an either or, but you mentioned that these foods are mostly aspirational foods. And in large parts of the world, populations are in fact lactose intolerant. Yet they, start to consume dairy mostly for aspirational reasons, partly. So I think if we want to sketch a picture on dietary justice, it's also important to, highlight the, let's say, the colonial linkages to promoting animal-based foods, because there are many countries in the world that were not dependent on an heavily animal-based diet that now are. And again, it's of course there's many types of communities, and I don't want anybody to be malnourished, but I've worked with a lot of NGOs in countries in the global south where indeed you see this big divide, not only between countries, but mostly between the rural and the urban. So in the rural valleys, you still have this small-scale livestock with ruminants, indeed for the essential nutrients. But then in the cities, you see basically the consumption of animal-based food skyrocketing. You see these nasty factory farms, shrouding out of the as soon as you're out of the city, you see all these massive farms sprouting up. And you mentioned that how we're going to tackle the balance, because as soon as you're going to promote animal-based diets, and you take that whole aspirational aspect with it, before you know it, you have a almost industrialized animal farm system in place, which has huge consequences also for the local livelihood, for the environment, because you have major runoff, but also for the risk of zoonotic pandemics, because mostly these farms do in fact encroach nearby regions where there's a lot of transmission going on with wild animals. So I think dietary justice should also highlight these really harmful aspects that come with promoting animal-based foods.
So dietary justice should come with addressing the challenges as well. So I'm going to start with you, Rory, because you've done the global north, global south thing. Can you speak to the challenges of what's happening on the outskirts? Can that be mitigated? Is it even possible? What's your view there? And then I will come to you. Because I'm going to ask you to address the issue of, are we forcing people onto an animal-based diet?
Yeah, my experience from lower income countries is probably a little bit different. I haven't seen massive animal production systems sprouting up on the edge of major cities, and I think that mainly the reason for not seeing that is that poverty is not driving any demand for huge volumes of animal source food in most cities of those countries, or at least not the ones that I've lived in. Having said that, anywhere where you've got increasing demand, you do need to make sure that development is taking place in a way that is capable of meeting that demand sustainably and not overstimulating demand for something which can't be met sustainably. And that's the reason why we and the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, but also in the dairy sustainability framework, the Global Dairy Platform and other dairy organizations are working equally on the dairy side. And I would say dairy is probably more of a smallholder production system in many countries of the global south than beef is. Beef tends to be a byproduct of dairy in a lot of those countries rather than the main deal. And both the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef is working in 25 countries, including many in South America and a few in Southern Africa. But the dairy industry is working in many countries throughout the global south, and they are tackling some of these issues head on, particularly with regard to feed and fodder production, and they have their program aiming for global net zero on dairy production. And I think, that's what we need to encourage. I can't speak at all really about monogastric production system. It's not something that I'm heavily involved with, but I'm sure there are equally some sustainability initiatives in monogastric systems. What we need to remember with monogastrics is that they do compete more directly with humans for food because their digestive system is much more like our own, and therefore monogastric systems are likely to require a little bit more input in terms of avoiding competition between feed and food.
Just give her a chance and then I will come to you.
Thanks, and thanks very much for your question. I think it comes back to the points Shakantala raised in her keynote about culture and the importance of culturally relevant foods as much as nutritionally valuable ones. And I guess when I think about the impact of kind of the export of westernized diets, of which a big part is around increased meat consumption, I think the point I would come back to is what we need to see is nutritious foods. And we see that many of the foods that come from those westernized diets are highly processed, they're high in fat and salt and sugar, and they're unhealthy for those reasons. And as much as we look to promote nutritious foods, we need to look to local and traditional nutritious foods as well. And that might be traditional forms of consuming animal-based foods, but it's also things like tempeh and tofu and plant-based foods, which are also very nutritious, but are perhaps falling out of fashion in compared to these westernized diets and processed foods coming in. So obviously this discussion is focused on the animal source foods, but it has to be put in the context of that overall diet and obviously those overall cultural preferences, trends and patterns. And I think the point you raise about how that relates to this global nutrition transition is incredibly important.
I'm going to go to the lady over there, and then Shakuntala, I'm going to come back to you. Based on everything that has been said here, I would like to hear from you whether food-based dietary guidelines could actually help in the tensions between how much you eat and how much you produce.
Thank you. I just have a comment to make and also maybe a question, which is that growing food to feed our food and then to eat them is largely unsustainable, and it takes up a lot of resources. And I think one of the speakers said that we want to make the food more nutritious, but actually growing these inputs that then go into animal protein industries takes away the land and the space and the money to actually grow nutritious foods. A lot of these foods are expensive because, a lot of countries are growing these inputs and they don't want to grow anything else because there's such a big demand for them. So I think if we think of reducing or kind of phasing away the requirement or the dependence on animal protein, then maybe we can start growing more nutritious foods and it would be more accessible. I see you nodding no, but I'd love to hear more about it. So what are your thoughts on kind of achieving climate and nutritional goals without animal protein, or kind of complementing with, that's not being the main part of the plate, but maybe a part of the plate, especially in growing economies, because they're not eating as much meat as the global north?
Okay. I'm doing musical chairs here. You seem to be like really very... I'm going to give you the microphone because it was very clear you wanted to say something, and then I will go to... Yes.
No, sorry. I am president of the International Dairy Federation, and I would like to point out what he mentioned. But first of all, there is plenty of studies that shows that healthy, sustainable diets must consider to have dairy and meat in the right quantity. is plenty of studies. There is no doubt about it. Second is, I want to remember always that we transform what is inedible for humans in high-value food and nutritious food. This second is very important. And about sustainability, environmental sustainability, we took action in dairy sector as IDF, as Global Dairy Platform with the Dairy Sustainability Framework. We have plenty of initiatives to reduce our environmental impact. So we are in action, we are doing a lot, we have done a lot, but we are still doing a lot. So this is very important. And about what she said, I want to mention a study made by Mary Beth Hall in USA in 2017, where she imagined to transform the society, the US society, in vegan society. And finally, even the problems, healthy problems, that is very detailed study, she showed that the carbon footprint of a food production is the same. To sustain the needs of a population, vegan population in USA, you must deforestate everything in USA, and you must import 30% of the food needed by the population. But I repeat, Mary Beth Hall, you can find the study in internet.
Thank you very much. Food-based dietary guidelines. Can you help us?
Before I go to food-based dietary guidelines, there's something that a point I want to mention, which I work a lot, which in the work I do, I think a lot and reflect a lot upon, and that's the diversity of culture, the diversity of food habits, knowledge, and what's becoming very important in many societies is convenience and the ways in which you prepare food and how do you reach nutritional needs. So if I would give an example, one of the big NGOs, World Vision, has been to about 30 countries, working with communities, poor communities, both in rural and in urban settings, specifically on diets, complementary foods. That's diets for children from the age of 6 months to 2 years. And I was quite amazed when I look at these 25 countries based on the mother's perspective and what they would like to feed their children, taking into consideration the knowledge they got on nutrition, but taking also into consideration their cultural practices and, importantly, convenience, that in all the 25 complementary diets, there was either fish, small fish, dried fish powder, some form of fish, or eggs. And the eggs, one of the major reasons for eggs, not only the nutritional value, but it was the convenience of how they can include eggs in the complementary feeding practices. Dietary food guidelines. Dietary guidelines. I do think, and thank you for asking me that question, I do think it's an important vehicle for moving both at country level or state level. In India, you would have dietary guidelines. It's also at state level. The country is so huge, the states are so huge, but also, and if you see today, dietary guidelines are taking into consideration both nutritional value, but also sustainability. And an important part of dietary guidelines is that they are generic and they must be made specific for population groups. So, for example, within national dietary guidelines, it's extremely important that there are parts of it that relate to, for example, pregnant and lactating women and young children. And in doing so, then it's important the knowledge, the capacity, and building up building up the ways that different population groups can make use of dietary guidelines is extremely important. But a good way forward, I would say, is look at school feeding practices and look at how we can use dietary guidelines within school feeding programs. That would also give the knowledge, the practices that not only give the child the nutrients that are important for that day, but importantly, build up lifelong habits for good dietary practices.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And we've run out, we kind of moving on, because we're running out of time. I have two more speakers to say something. I think you have been listening. So far, amongst the people who have said stuff, no one has really referred to pastoralist settings extensively yet. So maybe you've been listening. So when you reflect, can you indicate if there's something you can say on pastoralist settings as well? And then, because we are learning from this process, those of you who still have something you would like to say, I would appreciate if you could write your comments on a piece of paper somewhere and leave it with us, because then at least we will not lose out on whatever you would have said. I'll start with you, Pumlo, for your reflection.
Thank you, Namankulu. Thank you. It has been, you'll agree with me, it has been quite a lively debate and discussion. But again, from the discussions that we've had, from my perspective, I feel that we still have a lot of questions to answer. So I hope that even as we continue having this dialogue beyond this room, okay. I hope that as we continue to have this dialogue beyond this room, we can be able to pick up on a number of questions that are not yet answered. I will reflect on a few things that have come through, which have struck me as we have had our discussion. The first one is really from Shukantal. She actually touched on a number of very key points related to this topic of dietary justice. Can we really achieve climate and nutritional goals with animal agriculture? I think one of the first points that I found striking was, just the shift of looking at, let's say, diets, nutrition from a perspective of quantity, but to a perspective of actually looking at nutritious food. And we are saying, what I got from here is that when you're looking at nutritious food, you are looking at how the change in demand for nutrition is key and also affects, let's say, animal source protein. She also indicated on aspects related to diversity, cultural acceptability, and also safety as key things that we really have to look at when we are looking at dietary justice. Then the other things that I picked from her framing was that if you look at animal source food, it is actually extremely important for meeting nutritional goals. And reference was made to the fact that if you look at certain groups, you find that at a particular stage, especially lactating women, usually pregnant women, young children, they actually need some micronutrients which are not readily available from other alternative source proteins. So from that perspective, you find that livestock still remains an integral part of the food systems and also aspects of achieving dietary justice. Those women, those children, during the first 1,000 days, they do need the animal source protein. Then the other aspect that I found interesting again, which came through, were the issue of geography the issue of consumption patterns, the issue of, low and middle income countries compared to what? To the high income countries. I think it's just who touched on it. We touched on the aspect that if you're looking at why animal source foods are important, you have to look at climate, you have to look at environment, you have to look at nutrition. You also have to look at what is it that people are consuming. For instance, you find that in some low and middle income countries, you find that people are actually consuming more starch, not the diverse diet that is required to actually provide the nutritional requirements for those people. So in that instance, it means that if they are eating less of those animal source proteins, then they've got to eat more of them. Then in some countries, okay, I have to cut. I've got a lot of points, okay. But perhaps just to summarize it, there are groups who are over-consuming. There are groups who are under-consuming. And mainly in the West, there's over-consumption. The examples that were given. Then in the developing countries, there's under-consumption. So how do we take that into context as we are looking at the dietary justice? So it's not an easy answer of we are just simply transiting to what? To alternative proteins. But we have to recognize that there are requirements and there are needs, either affordability or needs that actually requires to at least look at either reducing consumption and also increasing consumptions in order to have, reduce the footprint. Then maybe the last bit, okay. I was just going to talk about the production practices that were indicated by Rory to say, yes, it is a bit of a challenge when you talk about, yes, the footprint. We all know that beef is actually livestock, especially, and animal source proteins are actually having on the environment. But we're also saying, look, there are these practices that can actually be improve or reduce the what? The footprint. You are looking at agroecology, you are looking at regenerative agriculture. So all these things, even genetics, breeds, there are so many things that can be done, which still need to be done. Yes.
Let me give her a chance to say something as well.
This is not an easy fix. I want all of us to leave this conversation with certain principles, right? And that's because it's not a polarized debate. Let's not simplify it. It's not about moving from livestock to alternative proteins or vice versa. So I want to leave all of us with a couple of principles that summarize all that we've discussed. The first one is the principle of equity. Equity in terms of who is this transition going to empower? Somebody mentioned wheat fortification. That's great. However, the more we move towards, let's make sure that the transition from livestock towards plant-based does not empower corporations at the expense of rural livelihoods. I also do believe we need to drastically reduce our consumption in certain areas whilst encouraging consumption in other areas. So equity is important. So that's one principle we should leave this place with. And equity covers concentration of power, justice, disparities in needs, and disparities in empowerment. The second principle is the principle of diversity. How do we make sure our nutrition and source of food is diverse? Also, how do we encourage cultural appropriateness? Somebody mentioned the colonialism. Let's also make sure that this transition is not empowering certain products that will end up taking us to the westernization of diets. That's something we should all leave this conversation with. Because I see our excitement with alternative proteins, and I believe there is an opportunity. However, being a food technologist, I'm also seeing us encouraging certain products over others. The conversation here should be plant-rich diets that are minimally processed. The moment we start shifting towards industrialized products, then we start having the westernization and colonialism playing again. The third principle we should leave this place with is health. How do we consider the diversity in health needs, the diversity in nutritional needs, the safety, the quality versus quantity, and the differences in, and how do we maximize nutrition within our earthly boundaries? Principle of inclusion. Like I said, corporations versus rural livelihoods. Let's bear in mind that as long as profits are driving the transition, there will always be unintended consequences at the end of the day. Let's think about what happened even with margarine. We wanted to shift from butter to margarine. We created a product, and now we've seen the problem with trans fat, and we're trying to reverse that. So let's be thoughtful about the solutions that we are championing. The fifth principle is the principle of interconnectedness. How do we connect all these issues? How do we take a food systems approach? It's not straightforward. It's not environment at the expense of nutrition, and then it's not nutrition at the expense of livelihood. We'll get to that. Don't worry, lots of conversations after this. The sixth principle is the principle of renewability. Remember, we are all competing for the same resources. How do we use grazing practices? How do we shift consumption and diets to make sure that we're truly sustainable? And to some extent, how do we ensure that whatever we're pushing for is not encouraging monoculture, is not encouraging certain products over others, that we're truly creating diverse food environments? And then the last one is the principle of resilience. How do we make sure that communities are truly resilient? Let's think about COVID and the supply chains. And if there is a pandemic or there's a climate crisis, how do local communities utilize their own products to survive in a climate crisis? And also, how do we make sure that localized value chains are encouraged instead of globalized value chains, which is going to happen the more we push for alternative proteins? It's a great opportunity. However, let's be thoughtful that we're not encouraging globalized supply chains at the expense of localized. So these are the principles we should leave this place with. There are no right answers or wrong answers. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
The dairy consumption in a large part of the world, that is the colonial process. And in the entire American continent, pre-Columbus era, there were no even pigs and livestock. It was all because of colonization. So my point is not that the alternative proteins are a sign of colonization. In large parts of the world, it's the animal-based products that are in fact reminiscent of colonization. So.
Thank you very much. We said, no, hang on. Look, you can hear the noise outside. People want to come in. What I would like to encourage you, though, it sounds like you have unfinished business. We said we're going to learn from each other. So make an appointment and have a conversation. But for now, I want to thank our speakers, Maria, Rory, Jessica, Shakuntala, Pumulo, and Vivian. Thank you very much for a very exciting conversation. We can continue this conversation because it's complex, but we can figure out how we move forward in different contexts by talking to each other. Thank you very much.